Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Social Housing Podcast. I'm Gary Haynes. I'm the Managing Director of Voicescape, and I'm joined today by the man of the moment who needs no introduction, but the Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham. Andy, really appreciate you taking time out today to join us.
No problem, Gary. I'm glad to come on. Lots to discuss.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll be pressured for time, but let's see how we get on. It's just over 5 years since you were last on Social Housing Podcast, as the country and the world were just coming out of the pressures of the pandemic. Doesn't seem like 5 years ago. Obviously, a lot's happened in the world and the country since then. But from a housing perspective, what do you think has been particularly successful in those 5 years, and what new challenges do you think face the world of housing and social housing in particular?
I think arguably there's been more progress on housing policy in those 5 years than probably in the 20 or 30 years before it. I can see you nodding, and that's good. I was wondering, as I was saying it, whether it's true, but I think it is. When you think of the Renters' Right Act, as it now is, obviously major legislation on renting, as well as a different approach being taken nationally on social housing, and the funding that was secured by Angela Rayner before she left government, the 39 billion. That is a significant investment over a decade. We continue to argue for the maximum to be devoted to social housing. I would actually devote all of it to social housing. But I do think if you look on both of those fronts, that is major change. It's still only in the foothills of the change we need, I think, but it's nevertheless, indicative of a very different direction of travel, and that's great news, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's good to have a direction and a stated intent. I think that the skepticism is always about how much can we achieve from a
Yeah,
relative standing start against those lofty goals.
yeah.
Um, it's been quite well publicised recently that the Manchester economy is growing significantly faster than the national economy. What do you think is particularly special about Manchester that's helping to drive that?
I think it's because Greater Manchester has pioneered a model of devolution that it's been at longer than anyone else, and it's really beginning to come together in quite a meaningful way. I think growth comes from bottom-up power and agency. That's the basis of it, and we've really started to create a situation in Greater Manchester where there's clarity about where we're going, what we're trying to achieve, and we've created if you like, a stable platform for investors. At a time when the country arguably has become more dysfunctional, Greater Manchester has become more and more functional and stable, and I think that has been a factor in our growth. I think it is obviously back to housing. So there's been significant housing growth in the city of Manchester. If you think back to the early 90s, I think it was something like 1,000 people were living in city centre Manchester, inside the inner ring road. Now it's way over 100,000. And, my daughter's just moved into the city centre, so recent experience. Contrary to what some people say, there are modern homes available at a range of rents that make housing here, let's say, more affordable to somebody in their 20s than London. So I think the driver of our growth is partly about the standard of living that a young person can have in Manchester compared to London, and consequently, that is becoming a big reason why we are continuing to grow. People are actually leaving London to come here. The jobs are here now in a way that they weren't. The size of the service economy in the city, particularly, but the growth that we've seen in the digital and tech sector, for instance. So I think it is about the talent ultimately as well, about, where can people access talent, that becomes something of a self-fulfilling story, which I think is what we've got at this moment in time. But we're not at all complacent. We continue to work hard on all of those things.
I mean, the Manchester city centre skyline is unrecognisable compared to what it was even a decade ago. Do you see these trends as sustainable, Andy, rather than a sort of temporary blip?
Well, I think the thing we've got to watch is over-gentrification. Now, people do remark on the skyline, and a lot of the towers have been built via a fund that was introduced by George Osborne, working with the legendary former chief executive of Manchester City Council, Sir Howard Bernstein. And Howard showed George how, if you go back to the sort of 2010s, there were many viable schemes in Manchester, but London-based finance just wouldn't lend because it just had a negative perception, let's say, or a downer on Manchester, saw it as a risk. So the Housing Investment Loans Fund was created to break that deadlock, and it has done, very successfully. There's not been a single default on any of the loans let via it, but I think people sometimes think that it was because it's got the word Housing Investment Loans Fund that people thought that was going to be a vehicle for social or affordable housing. It wasn't. It was simply building out the capacity of the city and responding to some of the pent up demand for growth in housing. However, it has enabled us to recycle funding towards social housing. It supports the Greater Manchester Good Landlord Charter, which I think we'll come on to discuss. So it has had a beneficial impact. But to come back to where I started, we do, though, pay close attention to the development of other cities where there's been, to a degree, a level of over-gentrification. And to the great credit of Manchester City Council and the leader, Bev Craig, and her colleagues, the city are now building the first homes for social rent in the city centre for 40 years on the Boddington's Brewery site, the old Boddington's Brewery. So while there has been, spectacular growth in the city, there is a determined effort to make sure that there is a range of housing available. And, if we didn't do that, Manchester wouldn't be Manchester, would it? If it forced a lot of people out and lost its character, well, we wouldn't let that happen. But in some ways, coming 20 years behind London with the mayor and some of the development, I think we can, if you like, learn from that. I remember being in New York with Michael Bloomberg shortly after I became mayor, and we had this a group of mayors he'd invited to New York. We had this walk on the High Line, and I don't know if you've ever been down the High Line in New York. It's obviously a raised old railway, but has become a public park. It's an amazing thing, but the gentrification along it was quite something. It was pretty stunning, to be honest. It just was utterly exclusive, and an old sort of industrial part of New York, the meatpacking district, just became a completely over gentrified space, and that was the main takeaway. And so I always think about that, and I think about when where we go next, we've got to make sure that we're quite intentional about supporting social housing, council housing within the boundaries of both cities, Salford and Manchester.
I think that's good, because I think we see all too often that sort of city regeneration or funding does result in gentrification, as you call it, and then that tends to leave behind the local people who almost can't afford to live in their own area, or the people on lower incomes, or who leave social housing being left behind. And it sounds like you've seen enough examples of that happen elsewhere that you consciously want to avoid that happen in Manchester.
Yeah, we would damage the soul of Manchester, wouldn't we, if we went down that particular path. So if you take another example, last week the government gave approval to Victoria North as a new town, or part of the new towns programme. That will see the building of 15,000 homes in that area, going up north, following the Irwell, to parts of Manchester that haven't necessarily seen the Collyhurst, other places that haven't seen the investment for a long time. And there's a very determined commitment. I think around 15% of those homes will be for social rent, which is, you know, a big commitment from the city. So the city's housing policy has changed under the current leadership, and you know it's kind of really interesting to see that. So that I think will be a theme as we go forward. We've said as a city region overall that we want to hit a tipping point in 2027 or 2028. Hopefully it will be 27, where as a city region, we are building more social homes than we are losing through Right to Buy. And we're confident that we can get there within that time frame, because until that's happening, you know, your situation's worsening, isn't it?
Just getting worse every year, yeah.
Yeah, and it's getting worse largely over most of England, isn't it, right now?
Yeah.
But 2 of our councils went into a surplus a couple of years ago. So, you know, we're beginning to turn that tide around. But until you hit that tipping point and then be in net surplus year after year after year, you know, we won't achieve our goals for the city region, which is a place, obviously, that's affordable to everybody and keeps its character.
I think whether you're born in the Manchester area or you moved to Manchester through choice, as I did about 30 odd years ago, it is a different place. It does feel different. It has a different vibe. It feels more successful than the rest of the country. You described the country as more dysfunctional than it was 5 years ago. I'd agree with you. So what lessons do you think could be learned at a national level from what Manchester has managed to achieve over the last 5 or 10 years?
It's a relentless focus on the things that will make a difference and improve people's lives. And it's a very intentional long-term approach to that. So for us, transport was holding the city back. You know, that was the first big thing that I really, you know, I did prioritise homelessness early on, and perhaps we can talk about that too. But transport, I had to fix that. And so, you know, we set about fixing it, and with a vision for it at, you know, the far end of where we want the B network to be when rail comes into the B network, in a way that Whitehall never did, never could. And, you know, that is the difference, isn't it? You keep building it until you've got, you know, because the city region requires it. And then you turn your attention to education, as I have done, building a technical education system. Again, we have to do that to make sure that we can keep, if you like, bringing the investors here, because they know the talent can be found here. But at the same time, you're improving people's lives through better transport, better education. And now we're looking at housing. You know, housing has been the hardest one, I would say, to sort of get your hands around. You know, it's such a fragmented, complex, huge challenge, isn't it? But increasingly now we are getting to grips with the housing crisis in Greater Manchester, as I've been explaining. And it's, again, because the city region requires it. You know, it will not succeed if it doesn't fix the housing crisis. So we just take that intentional long-term approach in a way that Whitehall and Westminster never do. There's a bit of a goldfish mentality down there. Something's a hot issue and then they'll move off and it's something else. And it's never really housing, is it? Housing's often at the bottom end of their to-do list. You know, it kind of, well, there's been a mentality down there, particularly under previous governments, that it's all the market and the market will fix it and you don't need to do very much to intervene. Well, that gave us the housing crisis, that mentality. And obviously we live with the reality of the housing crisis, unlike people in Whitehall who, you know, are quite removed from the reality of it. You know, our councils deal with the numbers of families presenting as homeless and needing temporary accommodation. You know, these challenges they bite hard and they're real and they're difficult. And to me, you know, kind of now almost a decade in this job and, you know, a decade out of Westminster, you know, and I look at the way national government treats local government, and it is frankly disgraceful. And I'm talking not about any political party here. I'm just talking the general approach. You know, the policy decisions, are particularly around housing, just place massive unfunded pressure on councils already starved of resource. Particularly if you take that issue of temporary accommodation, and it's just so wrong, isn't it? Where councils have statutory duties, but they're not funded to deliver them. Particularly that issue of the freezes on local housing allowance. Just kind of year after year, we're seeing one again, and it's just creates. It doesn't save money, or it maybe saves money for the Department for Work and Pensions, but it doesn't save money in the world of local government. In fact, it costs them quite a lot of money when we see those freezes come in, and it's that perspective that I think I've now got, that I'll be honest, I didn't have when I was in Westminster. But more people need to get out there. They need to come and work in combined authorities. I would say a lot of the people in the Whitehall departments, because they will see a very different world when they see it from this perspective to the one that they see in SW1A.
Yeah, you don't get the impression anyone down in Westminster has that joined up view that applies at a local level of the links between affordability and housing and transport and employment, and a plan to make all those things work together in a way that works in the local area.
I think there are really encouraging signs, though, on that. I would agree with you, certainly, going back a few years. But Steve Reed has led a council and does talk the same language as us. We had a mayoral council in Bristol recently, and it's really, I would say, that level of engagement with people like him is helpful, because he has been there. Georgia Gould, another one, who led Camden Council. There are actually quite a lot of people in ministerial positions who have been councillors or even council leaders, and I do think that is beginning to come through actually in policy. I think Matt Pennycook has been brilliant actually in terms of the way he's approached his role, with a real real knowledge and a real care actually for how things work locally. So I think that is it's almost 2 years into this government, but I do think they are beginning really to hit their stride, and certainly around devolution, we feel quite encouraged as to where the government is at. There are plans now to have a substantial measure of fiscal devolution by the budget, which is really encouraging for us to hear. Because if you free up the combined authorities of England now to work very differently with resource that is not just handed down, but we can obviously keep ourselves, then I think then you get into the realms where the housing crisis could be meaningfully addressed. I think so. It is getting exciting, to be honest.
You mentioned homelessness, and it was something I wanted to touch on, because obviously that's been a banner initiative of yours really since you became mayor. What's your view on how that's gone over the last 5 years since the last time you were on the podcast, and as we come out of COVID? How would you summarise the homelessness situation in Greater Manchester?
It remains challenging. We are in a position, though, where the numbers of people sleeping rough are permanently lower than where they were. So that period in the pre-pandemic phase, the second half of the last decade, 2015 to 2020, that was, really bad. But the numbers are permanently down. But, I get frustrated. I do hope that more areas could be persuaded to do what we do, a bed every night. So we currently provide 600 beds across Greater Manchester every single night, single room, and we're about to increase it to 650. I'm keen particularly to ensure that under the Armed Forces Covenant we have a fast track for veterans as part of that scheme, because the public just rightly it's appalling for anybody to have to sleep rough, but I just don't think people would do it and should accept it for anyone who's served the country. So we are expanding a bed every night.
Yeah.
what I would say is, and I would ask the current government to consider this. I think in effect, a bed every night is the pandemic policy. We were doing it before, and we never stopped afterwards. So this is the everyone in, as it was called at the pandemic. I would ask the current government to consider making it a permanent policy. It shouldn't be the case that anyone sleeps rough in this country. And if you look at the economics of it, the finances, it doesn't stack up in that way either, because, you know, it's just 1 or 2 nights spent sleeping rough can do significant harm to people's health, and then can require A&E visits, time in hospital. It doesn't make sense. And I just hope that we might get to a more humane position on the whole question of rough sleeping. You know, we make our commitment, but it's hard. You know, I kind of donate some of my salary. We raise money from the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity to support a bed every night. You know, it's not easy, but it shouldn't be like that. And I think because we do it, we obviously then get incoming from other places as well, and it gets even harder in some ways. What we need is a national commitment towards it. Beyond that, though, and I'm just talking about street homelessness here, we just need a different approach to housing more broadly. You know, fixing the crisis in temporary accommodation requires the tipping point to be reached nationally, doesn't it? Where we're building more social homes than we're losing. And, you know, I would also say that to the government. That should be a national mission. Get there as quickly as you can, and then stay in that position year after year after year after year. So, you know, you could potentially have eased the housing crisis by 2035 or something like that, if that is what, you know, becomes the policy. But, you know, while I do see signs of positive change on housing, I do think there has to be a significant change of gear, really, if we're to, you know, start to meaningfully address the pressures on the sector.
I think homelessness for me is one of those more visible signs of a level of dysfunction in the country, that it does feel like national government's not doing enough about, or has not got the right kind of balance on. But in terms of social housing and affordable housing, you've hit the nail on the head. You know, we've got to be providing more than we're losing every year, or the pressures just get worse year on year.
And I do actually favour, Gary, some new thinking in this space as well. I mentioned, you know, the legislation around renters, which is very welcome. And I know our councils now are gearing up to create teams to make sure people know their rights under that legislation. And, you know, we're getting ready to really start using it, linked to the Greater Manchester Good Landlord Charter. So that's really positive. But if I look at the private rented sector in large parts of the city region, particularly the north of the city region, where in the late 80s, early 90s, you know, whole streets were bought up for peanuts, weren't they? And, you know, we have sadly a situation where we have absent landlords who don't answer letters, and, you know, they just operate via a PO box and don't invest in their properties. And, you know, that holds back some of those proud places that, you know, really need decent landlords to look after their properties, and they do exist, and that's why we have a good landlord charter to recognise the good ones. But the others don't do them any favours, do they? They tarnish the whole sector.
No,
and that's
I mean, there are too many headlines of bad landlords doing bad things and not giving tenants basic care that really they deserve. And I think that's the key thing about the Good Landlord Charter, is really highlighting the visibility of those.
It's differentiating one from another, isn't it? And you know, we really hope in time it will become a you know, really recognised kite mark, you know, and you know, a badge of pride for the ones who are doing the right thing. But this then takes me back to the ones who won't join. It identifies them more clearly and their properties, and I don't believe they should have the freedom anymore to just keep renting out homes that are damaging to people's health. You know, we wouldn't let someone sell food that was damaging to somebody's health. So why do we allow the renting of a home that is damaging to people's physical and their mental health? Let's not forget that, because if you're in a home that is so poor, you're worrying probably every minute of every hour, and the effect on people is huge. And I hope, we could again persuade the government to go further down this path around legislating around the private rented sector. I personally would like to see a three warnings and you're out kind of a position. So if you will not invest in your property, if you won't bring it up to a minimum decent standard, and you are given a deadline to do that, then I think we should have simple powers of compulsory purchase. And I say simple so that because currently it costs councils a lot of money to try and take one of those processes. I think we need a much easier ability to intervene in the PRS and deal with some of those places where there is a concentration of poor housing, bad for the people who live in those places, but also drags the whole community down.
And we agree. And you said on last time you were on the podcast, people underestimate the importance of a safe and healthy home. It's a basic thing, and we need to push for more of that.
We need the Finnish philosophy, housing first, to be the UK national philosophy. And I remain of that view. 10 years into this job, I'm probably stronger of that view than anything. We've not had a housing first approach in this country since 1945 to 1950, and then a bit beyond. That is when we understood that decent housing was actually the nation's top priority. And since then, it feels like we've gone to a position, certainly since the 80s, where it's a commodity to be bought and sold, and it's a market, and some people will fare better in it and others won't. And that, I'm afraid, is a big part of our problem. You cannot see housing like that. If you do try and see housing like that, you will end up with a housing crisis, and that is exactly where we've
to actively protect the margins. Yeah, absolutely.
You do. So. But then again, I'm hopeful. I kind of feel I feel something of a sea change. To be fair, it happened when Michael Gove was there. Some of what he did in response to the death of Awa Bishak in Greater Manchester, the 2-year-old boy killed by damp and mould in his home, was impressive. And I think that did kickstart some of this change of thinking. So it's, it does have cross-party reach. And I think everyone has recognised that, housing policy has been quite neglected and has been trapped in a sort of one mindset place. And so signs of encouragement 5 years on, and we'll see where, if I come on this podcast.
That was the last question. Yeah, housing is a big topic. You're passionate about it. We're very passionate about it. But when we manage to get you back on the podcast in 5 more years,
2031,
what would you like to be able to look back on and go, that is a noticeable fundamental difference?
For me, this is the crucial moment as to whether or not we can meaningfully start to change housing in Greater Manchester. And if it doesn't happen in the next 5 years, then I would worry about when can we make it happen. We've created a good growth fund, Greater Manchester Good Growth Fund, and we are building it so that, with multiple partners, so that we can invest simultaneously across the city region, and with some of our more successful investments in the city, then subsidise investments elsewhere that will take longer, if you like, to come through. So an example would be, we recently gave some funding to the regeneration of Wythenshawe, which will bring 250 social homes through the Good Growth Fund, and that's an example of how it works in practice. The question is that going to be replicable enough across the city region to do something? And I do have to throw the question in here, Gary, at this point. I think we need significant reform of Homes England. They're not yet fully in the world that we are in terms of the speed of delivery. There's too much project by project. They've got to, I think, become more of an investor with us, where they let us go out there and don't micromanage every individual scheme, but we'll then be accountable to them for a sort of cumulative figure of social homes, affordable homes across the city region. And not, as I say, overly monitoring every single individual investment, and just back us and free us up to go for social housing growth in a way that we've not done before, as well as landholders kind of freeing up public land in a way that they've never. We've got a land commission here, and it's a bit stuck. It feels to me. I don't feel we're seeing the willingness of some of the big public landowners to sort of open up. But it's in the combination of those things, and I for me anyway, this city region has. If we carry on growing and being successful economically, but don't get a big change in our housing stock, then we're just going to be back in a world of extractive growth, exploitative growth, where our residents aren't set up to benefit from it, and that's not what we're trying to do. The Good Growth Fund is a very intentional drive to make sure growth benefits everybody, all people, all places, and yeah, we're going to prove it. We're going to do it. I say, we're going to make this work. It's just that if we got that extra bit of national change, I think we could meaningfully solve the housing crisis here. Certainly within a decade, anyway. If we go for it. So I'm optimistic as I speak to you today. I'll be. So when are you inviting me on? 2031? Is this when I'm?
Well, we'll try and get you back sooner than that, Andy. But your availability is always limited.
Well, obviously with the support of the good people of Greater Manchester, I'll be in my 4th term, coming to the end of my 4th term as mayor by then, and it's quite exciting really to think about where Manchester might be in the middle of the next decade. If we actually do what we're saying we will do, this place will be, well, they'll be smashing it. We're already the best place in the country, but there'll be no doubt about it by then.
Yeah. Well, you said on the last podcast, just free us up to get building. We need more social homes, and it's as true now as it was then.
Yeah, it's still not. We're sort of struggling out the straitjacket, is the way I'd describe it right now.
Well, let's keep struggling.
We've unbuckled a bit of it, and we're kind of we haven't quite burst out of it, but we'll get there.
Good. Well, really appreciate your time today, Andy. It's a really great chat. Thanks very much.
Cheers, Gary. Thanks for having me on again.
Cheers for now.